You passed the test! Mona, you are definitely a vampire.
I passed! I did it! Oh, wait! I am not a vampire! You're so stupid, just like you!
A Vampyre Story is a point-and-click adventure game developed by Autumn Moon Entertainment and published in winter 2008 by Crimson Cow. Players follow opera star turned vampire Mona de la Fête in her bid to escape the domain of the diabolical Baron Shroudy von Kiefer. Only her sharp wits, burgeoning vampiric powers, and the aid of Froderick the Bat can carry Mona away from Draxylvania and back to Paris. Autumn Moon were made up of a small core of former LucasArts employees who had worked on classics like The Dig, the Monkey Island series, and Full Throttle, and A Vampyre Story hewed closely to the traditional point-and-click gameplay of such titles, being controlled through the mouse and an on-screen interface that lets players examine, operate or pick up objects, converse with NPCs, or even use vampiric abilities like shape-shifting into bat form. The game was officially announced in early 2004, but a rocky development led to it limping onto stores over 4 years later, where it was met with weak sales and a lukewarm reception from critics. Some called it a worthy tribute to the golden age of graphic adventures, praising the light-hearted writing, goofy characters, bold art direction, and classic point-and-click gameplay. However, many other reviewers criticised the humour as stale and repetitive, felt that the puzzles were too obtuse, bemoaned frequent bugs and crashes, and even likened Mona's high-pitched voice to nails on a chalkboard. 2 points most reviewers concurred on was that the game's soundtrack was fantastic, but also that the game's story seemed to end rather abruptly. Players who made it to the finish line were indeed teased with the promise of a sequel, but this never materialised, and Autumn Moon ended up working on mobile and iOS games for a while. During the Kickstarter craze of the late 2000s, Autumn Moon founder Bill Tiller did attempt to secure funding for a prequel titled A Vampyre Story Year 1, but the campaign ended well short of its goal. Tiller hasn't given up though, and there have been on and off attempts at reviving the series ever since. Anyone who's ever played a typical adventure game will feel right at home in A Vampyre Story. The game's locations are divided into dozens of individual scenes, be they an entrance hall, a stable, a bedroom, or the bottom of a well. Mona can be directed to move to different points of interest in each scene and try to interact with them. Many of these serve no purpose other than background information and a cheeky comment from Froderick the Bat.
Nice assonance.
But others can be fiddled with or picked up. Once collected, items can be displayed with a right click to enter the inventory, where Mona can examine them again, try to combine them with other items, or just interact with them further. In some cases, items are too big to be dragged around, so Mona will make a note of them instead, but the items will still appear in your inventory and can be used just like any other collectible, albeit with an extra cutscene or two as Mona and Froderick go to pick them up. Being a game about vampires, there are a few unconventional options available too, like trying to fly over to an object, asking Froderick for help, or in the second half of the game, feeding on hapless victims. Mona can also gab with the supporting characters, like a snooty gargoyle or a woman of ill repute, though dialogue is comparatively simplistic and there's nothing to do in these situations except click through all the options. Most puzzles are relatively simple affairs, with players listening carefully to clues and then using some basic logic to figure out the solution, though they usually involve items or NPCs spread across multiple screens, so it's best to do a bit of exploring and keep your ears open, rather than putting your brain to work the moment you hit an obstacle. I think most of the points of interest in each scene are fairly self-evident, but if players do get fed up with pixel hunting, they can press a hotkey to display anything that can be interacted with. This isn't a perfect solution, as a few of these are a bit too close to one another and easily misclicked, or hidden out to the side of the default camera position, but it's a useful option nonetheless. There's a good chance players will eventually get tired of waiting for Mona to glide gracefully from one end of the screen to another, so I imagine most of us will end up using the spacebar or right-clicking area transitions to skip animations during slower parts of the game. The overall difficulty level seemed pretty average or even on the low side, at least for a casual adventure game player like myself, though there are a few red herrings and false solutions that can send the player off in the wrong direction. There were a couple of instances in which I had to check out a walkthrough, one involving a now dead internet address, and another that still makes absolutely no sense to me. I also got stuck for a while due to the fact that I hadn't realised one of the scene transitions actually led to a completely different location to where I thought it did. But when all's said and done, if you get completely stuck and don't want to go online, retracing your steps and exhausting every interaction option should carry you through. One problem with this approach to adventure games is that, with such a limited number of possible options, it's very easy to accidentally uncover the solution to a puzzle without realising you were even looking for it. I suppose the alternative approach is to block players from taking certain actions until the characters have a reason to take them, or overwhelming players with so many options that they'd never discover the solution clicking things at random. Both of these have their own drawbacks, though. The long and short of it is that, love 'em or hate 'em, you know exactly what you're getting with point-and-click adventure games like this. A Vampyre story went through significant stylistic revisions over the course of development. Early screens seemed to ape the classic 2D art of the LucasArts greats, but Autumn Moon later settled for a hybrid approach of 3D models placed in front of pre-rendered background sets. Although many cited Tim Burton and Pixar or DreamWorks as influences on A Vampyre Story's art style, Bill Tiller has clarified that it was actually based on the art of Edward Gorey and early 20th century pulp horror illustrations. Though the game sadly doesn't run natively at modern widescreen resolutions, it's still very pleasant to look at, with brooding gothic fasts, richly detailed interiors, and rolling moonlit hills. It does Autumn Moon's artists real credit that these visuals hold up so well even when crudely blown up to suboptimal resolutions over 10 years later. The 3D models and animations are also very impressive, though you'll soon notice that Mona has a slightly limited repertoire of unique gestures, and can seem a little dead-eyed at times. At first I thought this was intentional, but a lot of other characters also seem to suffer from RBF when not emoting. Other than that, my only real complaints are that some of the moving 3D parts on 2D objects stand out a bit, and more importantly, the in-game anti-aliasing option is a bit buggy, revealing some very obvious shimmering artifacts on Mona when she performs specific animations. I only suffered a single crash during my playthrough, though it's important to point out I was using the GOG release, as the retail versions and older digital storefront releases are apparently incompatible with Windows 10. Voice acting seems to have been quite a divisive topic for reviewers, but personally I have no complaints. Mona seems to be one of voice actress Rebecca Schweitzer's earliest roles, and despite the backlash, it doesn't seem to have affected her career. I thought Mona sounded absolutely fine, although I've been told I have a horrible nasally voice myself, so I probably just have a high tolerance for these things. I was disappointed that soprano Carla Isabel Moniz was brought on board for Mona's performance in the game's opening, but as far as I can tell, never used again. For a game revolving around an opera diva, there was a lamentable lack of actual opera. The rest of the cast were fine too, with everybody adopting their best stereotypical accents.
You see, the door's locked and my son threw the frickin' key out the window. Now no one can get in or out.
Sound effects like flapping wings, bubbling cauldrons, creaking trapdoors, and roaring monsters all ring clear and true, though the game eschews most ambient noise in favour of a very hefty score that features unique tracks for virtually every single scene in the game. A Vampyre Story was scored by composer Pedro Camacho. It's extremely hard to get a hold of the physical soundtrack for a Vampyre Story outside of Germany for some reason. It was a backer award for the Vampyre Story Year 1 Kickstarter, but never formally released, so you'll have to check out YouTube and SoundCloud, unless you want to pay out the nose for the German collector's edition of the game. It's really unfortunate, because Camacho did incredible work, capturing everything from dark, gothic organ solos to light-hearted Monster Mash mixes. I love the main theme's blend of operatic grandeur and mischievous comedy, watching a storybook flipping through Mona's backstory as the vampire herself wails her banshee keen. An equally haunting track is the boudoir theme, which plays in Baron Shroudy's old bedroom, now Mona's private chambers. It's a really understated mix of sorrow, regret, mystery, childlike innocence, and lurking horror. And it's a real shame that this track captures those emotions much better than the game itself does. In the black heart of darkest Draxylvania, in the centre of the treacherous Lake Varg, squats the fortress of Baron Shroudy von Kiefer, only heir to the vanished Baroness Vasilla von Kiefer. The castle has a bleak reputation. Whilst the Baroness was alive, it was a frequent destination for practitioners of the dark arts, none of whom were seen to return from their meetings with the Baroness. After Baron Shroudy's birth and the Baroness's sudden departure, the area became notorious for the sudden disappearance of local paperboys. The Baron himself travelled only by night, occasionally seen in the company of one beautiful woman or another over the years, who, like the Baroness's guests, would never be seen again. The truth is that the Baron is a soulless vampire and black magician, and Parisian opera singer Mona de la Fête is his latest victim. Kidnapped, murdered, and turned into one of the undead, Mona has not quite come to terms with her predicament, believing she has merely been cursed with anemia and a thirst for very salty Merlot by the Baron von Kiefer. Her only true friend is Froderick the Bat, who helps her plan her escape back to Paris. Fate smiles upon the duo when vampire hunters ambush and stake the Baron, but Mona and Froderick still have to contend with many challenges if they want to make it out of Draxylvania, from the lake monster Inky to the strict limitations of Mona's new on-life. As you can probably tell, A Vampyre Story does not take itself very seriously. The game is extremely heavy on dialogue, and a great deal of this comes in the form of jokes. A lot of jokes. Practically every second line is a joke. Look at a gargoyle and you get a pun about stonework. Look at another gargoyle and get a slightly different pun about stonework. Select some fruit and nuts and Froderick will make a double entendre about his fruit and nuts. You'll be hard-pressed to find a single interaction that doesn't elicit some attempt at humour from either Mona, Froderick, or an NPC, whether it's a cultural stereotype, lazy wordplay, pop culture references, or a nod to an old LucasArts game.
Who's that mean-looking dude with the pitchfork? And who is that standing next to him?
You mean the guy with the stupid look on his face and the name tag that says, "My name is George"? I have no idea.
And I understand it's subjective, but it's bad. The entire game, but the first half in particular, is a relentless barrage of horribly unfunny boomer humour. It's no wonder this game did so well in Germany.
Hey! Hey!
Players familiar with Autumn Moon's adventure game pedigree might appreciate these references, but I'm not 90 years old. The problem with these jokes isn't just a matter of taste, though. There's a practical issue here. Being an adventure game, the player is supposed to be paying close attention to every line of dialogue, so they can gather clues or learn more about the backstory. So you're basically being held at gunpoint, being forced to endure what is, at best, flippancy, and at worst, irritating verbal white noise, in the hope that somehow, somewhere in that nonsense, something of value has been communicated. There were maybe 3 or 4 instances in those 6 or 7 hours that actually made me smile, let alone laugh. The game seems to be allergic to taking anything seriously. Take Mona's internal conflict. Here's a woman ripped from her dream of becoming an opera star, killed, twisted into an undead monster, imprisoned by her tormentor, and so traumatized she can't accept what's happened to her. This even becomes a central plot point later on, as Mona needs to face what's happened in order to unlock her awakening vampire powers. But the whole thing is never played as anything but a joke. This also affects the dynamic between Mona and Froderick. In theory, you'd think the whole point of a streetwise talking bat is to play him off against the more serious tone of other characters or events. But everything in a vampire story is so silly and exaggerated that he's just one prancing jester in a line of many other capering figures. But again, this is just my personal taste. I'm a big fan of gothic horror and vampire stories, but not so keen on comedies, so I'm not really the target demographic for this game. Regardless of how well players took to Autumn Moon's brand of humour, it's unlikely anyone would be satisfied with how the game ends. What feels like the transition between chapters turns out to be the cue for the credits, and the promise of an episode 2 that never arrives. A lot of the concept art shared for the Vampire Story sequels shows characters and locations that had already been teased in pre-release concept art for this game, so it's pretty obvious the team ran out of time and money before they could realise their ambitions. Bill Tiller originally came up with the idea for a vampire story way back in 1995, when, on vacation in the Bahamas, he dreamed up the concept of a vampire girl who once sang in an opera, but now lived in a gloomy castle with her friends. Tiller would continue to flesh out Mona de la Fette's backstory over the years, but it wasn't until sometime after leaving LucasArts that he made a concerted effort to make a game out of it. It sounds like the road to getting a vampire story made was a long and grueling one, and it's clear that making a follow-up has been equally challenging. There are plenty of opinions flying about regarding why the market is so unfriendly to classic adventure games these days, but it's obviously not helped by the fact that a vampire story isn't exactly a household name like Monkey Island or Sam and Max. In fact, many years after the failed Year 1 Kickstarter, Tiller admitted that his struggle to revive a vampire story simply wasn't getting anywhere, and he could no longer see any viable options for resurrecting the series. But in 2019, Tiller announced that he had finally regained the rights to a vampire story, and has posted intermittent updates on the game's Facebook page, of all places. A Vampyre story might not be the holy grail of lost point-and-click adventure properties, but you've got to admire Bill Tiller's dedication to Mona and the gang. Hopefully one day we'll be able to see them reach the end of their journey.